Good morning or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, colleagues and friends. Welcome to the fourth meeting of LPSA's Regional Working Group for Sub-Saharan Africa. I suspect we may still be joined by a few colleagues, but why don't we begin? My name is Jamie Boex. I'm the Executive Director of the Local Public Sector Alliance. I have a few brief announcements before we proceed with the rest of the agenda. As you may know, since the beginning of this year, the Africa Working Group has been co-led by three co-chairs, Jane Kiringai in Kenya, Kawala in Cameroon, and Yap de Visser in South Africa. Each are incredible professionals with unique perspectives and a strong commitment to decentralization and localization in Africa. Unfortunately, Jane Kiringai, who was expected to chair today's session, is unable to join us, and due to an unavoidable scheduling conflict, asked me to moderate today's meeting. In fact, when I met with Jane about 2 weeks ago at a conference in Malaga, Jane confided in me that the new position that she had been appointed to by the government of Kenya after leaving her position as the chair of the Kenya Commission on Revenue Allocation has been so hectic for her that it makes it difficult to do justice to her role as co-chair of this working group. Although Jane has committed to remain an active member of the working group, she has nominated a colleague, Judy Udoma, the former CEO of Kenya's County Assemblies Forum, and another leading expert on devolution in Kenya, to replace her as working group co-chair. And Judy has agreed to take up that role. Judy has already been an active member of the working group and in fact contributed to LPSA's Africa Knowledge Week in December 2021. As such, I would like to thank Jane for her contributions co-chairing the working group until now. I look forward to having her continue as an active member, and I would like to welcome Judy in her new role as co-chair. We can maybe all say welcome and hello to Judy. Welcome, Judy. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jamie.
And next time,
I'm happy to be here.
Great, and I suspect that you'll be co-chairing the meeting next time. But
next time, yes. I will observe today's chairing, you are chairing, and next time I'll be ready to host. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. We're glad you're with us and you're in your new role.
Thank you.
As a second announcement, I also want to note that since last meeting, the global LPSA team has expanded significantly to make sure that each LPSA working group is now supported by a coordinator. Since August, the Africa Working Group has been supported by Lima Ben Lajamir, based in India, with additional support to be provided in the future by Jacqueline Matura, based in Nairobi. As such, I also want to welcome Lima and Jackie to the working group formally as well. And as a quick announcement, I want to remind you, if you prefer to follow the meeting in French, interpretation is available through the Zoom interpretation feature, thanks to Joël. Pour les collègues francophones, dans les contrôles de cette réunion, cliquez sur Interprétation et cliquez sur la langue que vous souhaitez entendre. Merci. With those announcements out of the way, let's start our meeting in earnest. Our first real agenda item is an update on the Africa School of Decentralization that took place in Addis last month. Let me hereby welcome Professor Zemelak Ayele. By way of introduction, Dr. Ayele is the former director of and an associate professor at the Center for Federal and Governance Studies at Addis Ababa University. He is also an extraordinary associate professor at the Dula Omar Institute of the University of the Western Cape. And together with Professor Yap Visser, Dr. Ayele co-convenes the Africa School on Decentralization. He has published widely in areas of decentralization, federalism, and electoral democracy in Ethiopia and Africa, including a book titled Local Government in Ethiopia, Advancing Development and Accommodating Ethnic Minorities. Zemelak, we were happy to hear and learn from you about the Africa Decentralization School. Good to see you. Over to you.
Great to see you. Hello everyone. I have a slide. Can I share? Can you see it from your side? Okay. Okay. We had the third African School of Decentralization here in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, last month. So this will be an update. By way of updating, I will also try to explain what the ASD is, what the objectives are, and how the last 3 ASDs went. So ASD is basically a 2 weeks international postgraduate course on decentralization in Africa. The main aim of the course is to examine theories and practices of decentralization, especially focusing on Africa. Especially, it tries or it aims to give content to the African Charter on decentralization. So, the African Charter on decentralization at the center of the African School on decentralization. Of course, there are different themes. We take different themes every year. For example, in 2022, good governance in African cities was the theme of ASD, and this year it was giving effect to African Charter on decentralization. The theme of ASD this year was giving effect to African Charter on decentralization. The objectives are basically about creating knowledge about decentralization in Africa, also creating network of scholars who study and conduct research and also practice decentralization on Africa. Also examine the state of decentralization in Africa from global perspectives. So these are some of the objectives of the African School of Decentralization. We select our participants basically from every corner of Africa, from every region. We try to balance in terms of our selection of participants from government officials, postgraduate students, members of local and international non-governmental organizations, and practitioners, especially local officials. We try to balance in terms of our selection from all these sectors. We are also very serious about gender parity. In all our ASDs, we have tried to achieve at least 50% gender parity. ASD is organized by Dala Omar Institute of the University of the Western Cape and the Center for Federalism and Governance Studies of Addis Ababa University. Why these two institutions? Because they have a very long collaboration and cooperation on issues of federalism and decentralization. Many of us who work at the Center for Federalism, not many of us, some of us who work at the Center for Federalism were trained at the Dala Omar Institute, and professors like Professor Yab Defisa, Professor Nico Stetler, they come and teach at Addis Ababa University Center for Federalism. They also serve as examiners when we have PhD students, or when our PhD students submit their PhD thesis. They also give lectures, so they also participate in conferences that we organize. So there is this relationship between us and between Addis Ababa University and University of Western Cape. In addition, there are also other European partners, for example, the Institute of Federalism of Freiburg University and URAC Research. We also work with them, but the main organizers of this ASD are the Dala Omar Institute and the Center for Federalism and Governance Studies of Addis Ababa University. ASD is held alternatively in Addis Ababa and Cape Town. The idea of ASD actually began in 2020. We wanted to hold the first ASD in 2020, and we couldn't do it because of COVID. Then in 2021, we held the first ASD online on Zoom for 10 days. So the first in-person ASD was held in Cape Town last year. And the second one, the third ASD and the second in-person ASD was held in Addis Ababa. Now, in terms of methodology, we follow interactive lecture based on preset content questions, which means we first send content questions to the participants and they get ready on those questions, and the lecturer comes and discuss issues with the participants. We also group them into different groups and provide them with questions so that they can interact with each other and also come up with their own opinions on various decentralization related issues. The training also includes field visits, especially with exam to appropriate government or international institutions, and evaluation, among other things, is based on examination. The lecturers are from Addis Ababa University and UWC, of course, and from Freiburg University. Colleagues from Kenya, Uganda, and other countries were also invited to come and lecture. We had also two lecturers who we found from this network, Paddy Knudsen and Baba Dodo, who were fortunate to have in Addis Ababa, who came and gave lecture to the participants. So the lecture looked like this in Addis Ababa in the 2023 ASD. There were a lot of participation. Participants also had a presentation after group discussion. Also, they submitted essays, and based on that, also they made presentation. When they were in Addis Ababa, we took them to the African Union headquarters, and officials from the African Union headquarters were kind enough to give lecture to the participants, also show them around the African Union headquarters. There were also some fun time. For example, you can see them having Ethiopian coffee and also having food at cultural restaurants. So it also formed part of the training. What did we achieve in the last 3 ASDs? Of course, we successfully conducted 3 ASDs, the first one online, the second in person. We saw great interest from basically every corner of Africa. We received over 400 applications every year. We could select only about 25 up to 30 participants every year. From more than 20 countries. Only this year we selected from 15 African countries, but before that it was about from 21 or 20 African countries. And the feedbacks and evaluations that we received thus far show that there is a great satisfaction with the courses, with the issues that were raised, and with the discussion. So I think it was a great initiative. Challenges are, of course, the first one will be financial challenge. The course is is offered based on funds that we raise from donors, and we are facing some challenges in terms of getting enough money to run ASD. The other is related to language. As you know, in Africa, there are Francophone countries, Anglophone countries, also Portuguese-speaking countries. We were not able to accommodate everyone since the course is offered only in English. It was a bit of challenge to accommodate everyone. Of course, people from Francophone countries who speak English are accepted into the program. But we were able not to accommodate those who do not speak English. So that is the challenge. Those are the challenges that we face. Let me stop here. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Zaimalak. Before you go, maybe can you share a little bit about your success in meeting with African Union, perhaps, and the level of conversation you had? Were you able to convince them to rush the charter more, or to emphasize the implementation, or what? Can you give us a little bit of a flavor on the interaction that you may have had or among participants about the state of the African Decentralization Charter, out of curiosity?
Yeah, even before the ASD, I was in contact with people from African School of from the African Union. There is a department which is supposed to follow up the ratification of the charter. I met people from that department once, and myself and also Nico Stetler went on and met them at another time. And we told them that we want to work with them on this ASD because our focus is also on promoting the African Charter on Decentralization. And initially they showed us some interest to work with us, then kind of vanished. After the school was started, we had to kind of again, make contact with them. Finally, at least we were able to get the participants there, and also to make them interact with the officials from that side. So from what they told us, there is kind of not, African countries are not that much enthusiastic about ratifying the charter. There is a lot of challenges thus far. The charter was adopted in 2014. Thus far, only about 8 countries have ratified the charter. The other countries have not ratified the charter. So they are trying to push from what they told us, but it is not easy. There is no kind of enthusiasm from many African countries. That is what they told us.
Super. Thanks very much for that. Wonderful. Are there any questions in the audience by chance? I see Myrna is sharing the link to the Omer Institute. I know that there have been some questions already that I will forward to you separately on wishing to collaborate with the African Decentralization School. Unless I don't see any questions, with that, why don't we proceed to the next agenda item?
Jamie?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Yes, this is Elizabeth from Zambia.
Please
Am
go
I
ahead.
audible?
Yes, go ahead.
Jamie, am I audible?
I can hear you, Elizabeth. Why don't you go ahead?
Hi, Jamie, am I audible?
Yes, you are, but...
Okay, yeah, Zamalek, thank you very much for your presentation on the university. Listening to your presentation and your submission, I take note that the emphasis is so much on federal government governance arrangements. I was just wondering, for a country like Zambia, we are a unitary state. So I'm just wondering how we can benefit from the courses that are being provided by the university. Further to that, I wanted to also find out if there's been any Zambians that have attended the courses that you are offering at the university. This is quite important because coming from a unitary state, I think we could learn, some lessons from what is happening from the federal kind of arrangement, and we would also, be able to share our experiences. Operating from a unitary kind of, arrangement. So maybe just to quickly understand the possibility of a unitary country like Zambia participating in this particular course. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay.
Hello.
Okay.
Okay, Prof. I want to help on the latter part of it. I am Edward from Sierra Leone. She asked if there has been any person from Zambia, and I know the one they had in South Africa. The mayor of Lusaka was there. There was one professor from the university, Professor O'Brien, or Dr. O'Brien, and another lady, two university lecturers, and the mayor of Lusaka was also in attendance. So yes, there has been participants from Zambia before attended. I cannot say for the one that was a few months ago in Ethiopia, but because I was fortunate to be one of the students in South Africa, that's why I came to explain that, and it was interesting to learn from the Zambian experience also. Okay, over to you, Prof.
I'm on mute. Thank you, Edward, for also intervening. Yes, two things. First, we're not only focused on federal countries. We deal with both federal and non-federal countries, so long as there is some kind of decentralization program in and coming to Zambia, we had participants from Zambia last year and also this year. Actually, if I am not wrong, Paddy is from Zambia. She was one of the lecturers at our ASD. So Zambia was well represented in the ASD.
Wonderful. Thank you for that clarification, Zemelak.
Jeremy?
Yes, please go ahead. Follow-up question.
Yes, thank you very much for that feedback. Maybe just to introduce myself further and to see how we can strengthen, this relationship with the university. I'm coming from the Decentralization Secretariat of Zambia. So there's quite a lot of information that we can share with the university out there. And I'm glad that the link has been shared, and I think we can pick it up from there. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. And Elizabeth, thanks for joining. I know the Decentralization Secretariat in Zambia is quite busy these days. So we're happy, A, that you found the time to join us, and B, that you're using the LPSA to link your work with other efforts on the continent, both no doubt to share what you're doing, but also to learn. So maybe we can already invite you for a future meeting to share what the latest is on decentralization in Zambia. So thanks for being here.
Sure, that would be great. That would be great, Jeremy. Thank you very much.
Thanks for being here. With that, let's go to the next agenda item. Zemelak just mentioned that the implementation of the African Decentralization Charter is not very strong, perhaps, that the uptake hasn't been universal. Part of LPSA's agenda on this effort is to try to assess the state of local governance institutions in Africa and other continents using the Logica framework. And Nick Travis is going to share a brief update. Nick.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. And thanks for the opportunity to update the working group on this. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully you can see. Let me just... Cool. Okay. So as Jamie mentioned, the Logica framework is, I guess, one of the core knowledge tools that LPSA works with, and its overall objective is to provide an assessment of the multi-level governance structure of countries. It's a suite of tools from which experts and countries and so forth can pick from, depending on the level of analysis that you want to do. At the moment, we've been focusing on what we call the intergovernmental profile, which is sort of the most basic or the first step in conducting a full assessment. And this really aims to establish the basics. What is a country's organizational governance structure at the subnational level? And once we've identified those entities, how do they work? What is their nature? Are they what we would refer to as legitimate, empowered, real local governments, or are they something else entirely? And we've been rolling this out in different regions, most prominently the Africa region and the Asia region, but we intend to roll this out across all regions of the world over the coming months. And one of the key reasons why we're doing this is the fact that there's actually quite a big knowledge gap across the literature, whereby we actually don't know whether fully empowered local governments exist across countries. there isn't really a global public good, a metric that evaluates the extent to which local governments exist across countries and are empowered to respond to local needs. And so the Logica framework aims to sort of fill this knowledge gap, and we hope that over time it can contribute to filling those gaps in a substantive way. So with that being said, before I dive into what we've been doing, the nature of this work does involve some terminology, because as I said before, we're really looking to understand the nature of the institutions that exist at the subnational level across the countries that we are examining. And in particular, we're trying to distinguish between what we call regional and local governance institutions and regional and local governments. And often in the literature, these are used interchangeably and are sometimes intended to mean the same thing. And in the Logica framework, we make a very clear distinction between these two things. The former governance institutions could refer to many different types of entity. It could be a legitimate devolved local government. It could be a deconcentrated entity, a field office of the central government, or some other sort of institution. Whereas when we refer to local governments, we really very specifically and exclusively refer to entities that adhere to our LPSA definition of a devolved subnational government institution. And this is to make sure that we can distinguish between the two when we're understanding the nature of the entities that are working at the subnational level across countries. And so in terms of what we consider to be a full subnational government, we have to see that it is a legal entity separate from the higher level of government. In other words, it's a corporate body. It needs to perform public sector functions. That's what local governments are specifically designed for. And within the jurisdiction that they operate, they have to have at least a minimum level of political, administrative, and fiscal powers that enable them to respond to the needs and priorities of their constituents. And the methodology, which we won't go into in this presentation, sets out what we mean by adequate levels of autonomy in each of these areas, and applies an approach to deciding whether these institutions have this or not. And that's really the dividing line between what the Logica framework defines as a subnational government versus a subnational governance institution of some other characteristics. So we've been working and then based on the methodological outcomes, based on the questions that we ask and the answers that we find, we can classify, the methodology classifies entities into actually up to 6 different sorts of entity, although in the intergovernmental profile, it reduces these to 4 broad categories. Starting on the right-hand side in the red, we have fully devolved subnational governments with extensive autonomy and authority, which is what I think everybody would consider to be a legitimate, fully formed local government with enough powers to respond to the needs of its constituents. Below that in the orange, we have devolved subnational governments, but with some degree of limitation on its autonomy and authority. This could be limitations in its functional responsibilities, or such as single purpose entities, or it could be some sort of some curtailment in those fiscal, administrative, and political autonomy that we mentioned earlier. And then a bit below that is a category that we call hybrid, which is an assessment that suggests that the entities that exist have some features of devolved local governments, but also have some features of non-devolved and deconcentrated institutions. And in these cases, it's normally that some aspects of the political, fiscal, or administrative capabilities are quite significantly curtailed, and so they cannot really fully respond to the needs of their constituents. And we'll discuss a little bit more about that shortly. And then lastly, we have institutions that are definitely cannot really be considered devolved at all. And these would be sort of the field offices or deconcentrated entities of the higher level government. And so we classify these levels of governance and entities into one of these four different categories. In the Africa region so far, we have conducted assessments in the following 6 countries. I'm not, due to time limitation, I won't go into the full details of each of these countries. We will be writing a report before the end of this year that will go into such details, and so that will be an opportunity, hopefully, to present on that report in the future. But I will just run through some headline comparisons just to show the variety of findings that we've had across these different countries, and how different subnational structures, entities, and types of entity across these few countries that we've examined so far. So very briefly, in the case of South Africa, we have a fairly clear and relatively straightforward structure, three tiers of subnational governments, and all of them can be considered legitimate, fully formed local governments with extensive powers across those 3 core areas. In Kenya, we have pretty much just one tier of subnational government. There are those city and municipal boards, but not those are not nationwide. And again, in that single tier, we have assessed that those county governments are fully formed local governments as well. Then we go to somewhere like Ethiopia, which is a much more complex institutional arrangement, where you have, again, 3 tiers of subnational institutions, some of which are deemed by the logical framework as fully formed subnational governments. Others are defined or assessed as deconcentrated entities, and others are these hybrid entities, which have features of both. And so you have a much more complex set of outcomes in a country like Ethiopia. In Malawi, you have one tier, and it's not a fully formed local government by the logical framework. In Uganda, again, you have quite a complex, multi-layered local level subnational government structure. Again, a mixture of what we call hybrid and non-devolved entities. None of the entities in Uganda were considered to be fully formed local governments. And then lastly, in Tanzania, again, you have this mixture of outcomes, but mostly fairly entities that have fairly significant restrictions on their autonomy, to the extent that many of those entities cannot be considered even hybrid local government institutions. And so you may be asking, why are so few of the entities that we looked at, so much of the subnational government cannot be really considered to be fully formed local governments? And these are the sort of things that we picked up. And there are 3 main areas of concern, if you like. One is related to sort of the political autonomy of regional and local governments, and we observed that in practice, even if regional and local governments are supposed to have a degree of political autonomy, de facto there can be routine political interference from higher level governments. In some countries like Malawi, it's actually not de facto but de jure. It's actually the arrangement whereby laws require approval from the higher level. In Malawi, actually, national members of parliament are part of local councils, and so can significantly influence the political discussions and decisions at the local government level. And so that significantly restricts the local autonomy in the political sphere of local governments. In other places, it was very common to observe quite significant restrictions on the administrative side. And so in Uganda, for instance, the officers and the staff appointed at the subnational level are often actually appointed and managed by the high level local governments or high level national government. And those officers and staff are subject to dual subordination. So they don't only just report to their local government superiors, but also have a role in reporting to the national level ministries that they fall under. Or in the case of Tanzania, local governments do not have the ability to determine their own organizational structure, which is determined for them by the national government. And so that really restricts the administrative capabilities of local governments to the extent that they are not fully autonomous. And lastly, we found that in the fiscal area, there are very often significant curbs on decision making. So it was quite common to observe countries where subnational budgets, so the budgets of local governments, while they may be drafted and approved at the local level by the local council, often they have to be approved by high level authorities. And sometimes the local government budgets even appear as a vote in the national level budget that is approved by the national parliament and can be changed, modified to varying degrees. But clearly, if local governments cannot fully decide on how they spend their resources, then they lack fiscal autonomy in a significant way. The other aspect observed in some countries, such as Uganda, is this very high reliance on fiscal transfers from higher level governments, which often have very restrictive conditions attached. So you have your wage grant, you have your operating grant, you have your capital grant, all within a particular sector, which have to be spent in specific ways. Really reduces the ability for local governments to decide how to spend the resources that they have, and to the extent that their autonomy is very significantly curtailed. And so, in summary, we found that in some countries, the local governments are not always able to set their own policies without interference from high levels of government. They weren't able to manage their own officers and staff to deliver on those policies. And very often they weren't able to allocate budget to finance those specific policies. And the logical framework views this as a significant curtailment to the extent that they cannot really be considered fully devolved local governments. So that's a summary of the findings that we've generated so far. As I mentioned, the next step will be to go into is to convert this analysis into a report. We're also looking to expand the number of countries that we examine to get an even broader set of experience and information across the region. And we'll be taking that report over the next month or so, and hopefully, we'll have another opportunity to report in a bit more detail, perhaps, on what I've been able to talk about today. With that, I'll hand back to the chair. Thanks very much.
Nick, maybe could you share one or two sentences about the work going on in Asia and Latin America so that we can compare the Africa region?
Yes. So in addition to these 6 countries that we've been working on in the Africa region, there's been an ongoing effort over the last months in South Asia and in East Asia. And the idea is that we would then, and also more recently, an effort in Latin America, where we're working with an organization to fill out the Logica IGPs in that region. And so we should have very soon a fairly rich set of country level analyses from those 3 different regions that we can then conduct comparative analysis on. I think that we will probably finish the work on these 6 countries earlier than the other 2 regions, but I suspect that by perhaps the first quarter of next year, we'll have a much more detailed set of countries from the other regions against which we can evaluate the Africa countries.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Nick. That's great. So indeed, this would hopefully allow us to assess together across the world how, for instance, Africa is performing as far as the degree of empowerment and decentralization as a continent or as a global region versus other global regions, and to see what can be learned from that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Now, one of the countries we haven't seen, there's a question in the chat from Lena Weiler. Extremely interesting. Will this be recurring or a one-off exercise? You want to take that, Nick?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a very good question. I think the fact that we're trying to conduct these assessments essentially for every region, and therefore for pretty much every country in the world, it is quite a significant undertaking. And we're going region by region initially. And I think the answer is that yes, we would like for the work to be recurring. It would be great to do it every few years at an appropriate juncture, given that often in this area of decentralization, reforms take a long time to come to fruition. So it wouldn't be practical to do it on an annual basis, but certainly with a slightly longer time frame, I think there's a lot of value to doing it every 5 years or so. I don't know. But that would be sort of funding dependent and demand driven, I think. But yeah, I think the intention is, if possible, once we've got the first round of assessments done across all the regions, would be then to take stock and then to plan forward about when they would be redone.
There's a few more questions in the chat. I'll be happy to take one from John. Is there a mechanism to review these findings with local or national officials? In fact, whenever possible, these are prepared by colleagues. Zemelak, who just spoke, was the colleague who prepared the Ethiopia profile. Tinash, I believe, who's with us today, the University of Western Cape prepared the one for South Africa. So we're trying to make sure that there is a degree of national ownership. And what we're trying to do, in fact, is bring colleagues together through our working groups to see if we can make sure that there are that these profiles are owned at the country level, and that they accurately reflect the standards that we're applying. With that, perhaps let me suggest that we move on, because we have a rich agenda today. So thank you very much, Nick. Duly appreciated. And if there are any further questions, Nick is easy to find. So thanks for that. Up next on the agenda, we have what I would say is the first of two main presentations today, the meat of today's discussion. The first of those two presentations is a devolution in Mozambique with a focus on intergovernmental fiscal relations by Lena Weiler. As many of you know, the devolution process in Mozambique has been proceeding in fits and starts over the past several decades, I would say, and certainly speaking from my perspective, I would love to hear about the latest status of decentralization in Mozambique. So thank you, Lena, for joining us. By way of introduction, Lena Weiler is currently the managing GIZ's Good Governance Finance Program manager in Mozambique. She holds a double degree in public administration and political science, and dedicated most of her professional life to international development, working for various organizations. As part of her long-term assignments in Indonesia, Zambia, South Africa, and Mozambique, she advised governments at national, provincial, and local level on multi-level governance, intergovernmental fiscal relations, and urban development. As a local/urban governance lead of GIZ over 6 years, she designed, advised, and evaluated numerous local and urban development projects in Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas. With that introduction, Lena, let me hand it over to you. You already have your slide up, fantastic. We look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jamie, and thanks for the invitation. I hope you can see everything all right. It's the first time I present on Zoom. Can you believe it? Very familiar with other mechanisms, so please just shout if you can't see the presentation or can't hear me anymore, as I also only have one screen at my disposal, so I will not be able to accompany the chat over time. So yes, great. I'm very honored and thankful to be able to join you today. I didn't know the LPSA. I know GIZ has been in contact with you over via various other projects, but it's my first interaction with you, and I think it could be a really interesting group also for a lot of our Mozambican counterparts and colleagues to get more involved with. So yes, 15 minutes to look into the ups and downs of the decentralization process in Mozambique, and also looking at the fiscal, financial issues. Of course, is a tall order. So it really won't be more than a snapshot, I think, today. And I try to keep within the time because I think probably the most interesting part would be a conversation. So I've got a few slides on the, let's say, the context, decentralization in Mozambique, with the assumption that not too many people are well familiar with the process in Mozambique. It seems you are, Jamie, but just already the geographical plus, in particular, the language issue makes Mozambique quite particular, has a different colonial history, of course, than most of the English-speaking and French-speaking countries on the African continent, and hence is often not well known, and they're not that well networked, I would also say, within international or regional forums such as this one. Then I have a few slides on, let's say, the municipal fiscal framework and how municipalities are financed. And then just a few slides what we are doing as GIZ in Mozambique and beyond, but that's really very short. So what are some key features and timeline and peculiarities of the Mozambican decentralization process? You can already see it only starts in 1990, and maybe one peculiarity, at least compared to some of the countries in the region, is that the precursors of local government, yes, they are there in colonial times and also afterwards, but as you will know, Mozambique suffered from a long war and continuing conflict after liberation, which I think also delayed a lot of the reform processes that some of the neighboring countries went through. Suffice to say that there was a new constitution, a multi-party democracy constitution, like in many of the neighboring countries, in the first half of the 1990s, very shortly after the constitution was changed again to allow for municipal elections. And first, municipalities or elected local governments with distinct functions were instituted, but only with a limited number. If I recall correctly, I think there were 30 or 35 municipalities across the country, only covering a very small share of the space, but also, of course, also the people. So it was, let's say, like a hesitant step, but an important step into a decentralized governance structure in Mozambique, with first municipal elections taking place in 1998. Since then, there has been a gradual expansion of the numbers of municipalities. I think we just had municipal elections. I don't know if you followed them. Actually, we find ourselves in quite a difficult situation and time. With highly contested elections, political violence during the electoral process, and highly contestation around the results with demonstrations in all urban centers over the past week, really. Election day was the 11th of October last week, and the official results are broadly not accepted by any of the opposition parties. So we're heading into a very difficult time in Mozambique as regards municipal government. And we just had these 6 elections with a number now of 65 municipalities Before we had 53, so we have 12 new kids on the block, around the block. In a few months from now, when the new mayors will and municipal assemblies will take office. This is the key element, let's say, of the first key element of the decentralization process. During the whole time, the political conflict, not political only, of course, also between the state and what was at first, some call them terrorists, others call them the opposition party, which was armed. There was a continuing conflict with ungovernable areas in the entire country. And that the last moment and various peace agreements, the last one in 2018, which was the basis for Renamo to finally lay down arms and transform itself into a political party only. And with that, as part of this last peace process deal in 2018, the second big milestone in the Mozambican decentralization process took place with a constitution that came up with provincial elected government. The constitution was amended in a very, very short time in 2018, and already in the year after, provincial governments were elected. And now we have an elected provincial government sphere, but at the same time, a new deconcentrated structure at provincial level was put next to it. And until now, the distribution of responsibilities between these two organs, devolved, let's say, provincial government and deconcentrated authorities with a direct influence from national government, is still relatively unclear, leading to a fairly inefficient and conflictive situation. They also put relatively unusually a feature into this constitution that said that districts would be elected in 2024. Or 2024 next year is we have general, provincial and national elections again. And the constitution said that districts would be elected in 2024. This, however, has a few months ago, where there was another revision of the constitution, which now says, no, we will not have district elections. We're not ready. The provisions, the framework conditions need to be established first. We're entering into a process of reflection. In fact, Jaap de Visser, present here, has been working with us on this reflection process. Various commissions have been instituted and are currently reviewing and looking forward, giving up contributions into what could be a decentralized or multi-level governance structure for Mozambique. We are unsure whether districts, which cover all the areas which are not municipal in Mozambique, whether they will ever be elected or elected in the next couple of years. I think that's a question that's yet completely open. Okay, I think I've, sorry, let me open all of this. I've touched on most of this. I think it's important to note that Mozambique in general has a highly centralized government system, at least compared to those countries in the vicinity, and also a very centralized public administration culture. I've touched on the importance of the peace process as a driver for major decentralization steps. And I think I've also said in one way or the other that there is no substantial vision yet for a system of decentralized governance, let alone for the relations between the various levels of government. But at least I'm convinced that those devolved structures that exist now, meaning one, municipalities, but also provincial governments, are here to stay, and that somehow the genie is out of the bottle. And there's a lot of interest to keep these going. Whether they're functional is maybe another question, and maybe this leads me directly to the question of how Mozambican municipalities are financed. I will not look at the provincial level. That's a much more recent step of devolution decentralization, as you've seen. The municipalities are for us from a Mozambican perspective, the better structured and more experienced level that, as I said, is slowly being the idea was that it slowly would cover the entire country. So before we look into finance follows functions, so let's first look at the main municipal functions. They are not very different from many of the other local governments in the region. So primary health, primary education, waste removal, water provision, sanitation, etc. These are core municipal functions in Mozambique. The fiscal framework is set up, as in many other countries, by own revenue sources, and there are significant own revenue sources. There is a building tax, or let's say property tax, a local business tax. There's a host of municipal fees and charges that municipalities can collect. There are national transfers. The core one is the Municipal Equalization Fund for current expenditures, which is calculated on the basis of geographic coverage and number of inhabitants. And there's a small element of an investment fund, which makes up roughly 50% of the 1.5% of the national tax revenues, making it a total of maybe 2.25% of the national fiscus that is annually transferred to the municipalities. There are possibilities for loans, but they are very limited and, of course, also often only on the basis of central government guarantees. And of course, Mozambique being one of the poorest countries in the world, there's a lot of international funding going to municipalities supporting the development of infrastructures there. So let's have a look at one particular, less at maybe on the revenue side, but on the expenditure side, how this plays out. And you can already see that from the national, from a view of the expenditures in the year 2022, the largest piece of expenditures happens at central level. Then there are some provincial level expenditures. Districts make up a big part, but municipalities only 1.42% of the entire, let's say, cake, which is made up into this municipal equalization fund and the investment element. Yeah, in comparison, I don't think I need to stress this here, but I'm German, so I think in Germany the expenditures from local government are somewhere between 40 and 50% of the total expenditures of all levels of government. So what does GIZ do? We work currently with 17 municipalities out of the old 53, in particular to improve their own revenues, to improve the intergovernmental fiscal relations framework. And you can see some results, at least, that while municipalities, this is just a sample of 8 of our municipalities, that while they are very dependent on national transfers, at least they manage to fund themselves with around 20%. But this is already the result of years of hard work, investment into cadastral systems, etc., and revenue collection, which has an impact, but it's limited. The key is in reviewing the intergovernmental fiscal relations. And that is, I think, also the key element we need to mention here. The limitations is that municipalities play a very neglected role in the transfer system, also compared to districts and provinces, given the functional responsibilities that they have. The percentage of 1.5% has actually remained the same since 1998, despite the increase in the number of municipalities and the increase in the relative share of the urban population with a fast urbanization process happening in Mozambique. like in some other countries, there is unfortunately a lack of predictability and delays in the disbursement of the fiscal transfers by the central government, making the investments even more difficult to be implemented at local government level. The criteria used to distribute the municipal equalization funds benefit municipalities with large areas, thus creating perverse incentives almost to grow in terms of space, and also to increase the settlements at a very low density, which in the end means higher costs for the municipalities to be able to reach these communities. So there's a lot of work currently underway by the Ministry of Finance trying to look at these inadequate incentives, and also at an increase of the municipal share. Also a key area point that the government wants to make headway on with our support and of others is to improve the data, the availability of data on municipal finances, because in fact the national government has very limited information about what is happening at municipal finance level, because they're not integrated into the national financial management system, or only partly, and hence it's really difficult also to develop evidence-based policies at national level. Yeah, with this, very briefly, what's our role in this? We have a program called Good Financial Governance, which is strongly focused at the municipal level, where we try to improve the financial sustainability of municipalities, the accountability towards the local citizens, and improve service delivery. We work at the national government on the intergovernmental functional and fiscal framework. We have a component that works on improving the capacities of the public service, let's say the human part, and the professionalization of the public service to implement this new decentralized governance system in an effective way. And finally, and very importantly, we work with the Supreme Audit Institution to further the external control on public finances at national level, but also at subnational level. And of course, this is just one of the programs of GIZ. We have, I think, currently 35 on the African continent that contribute to or support decentralization and local governance in the region. And with this, I think I have passed my 15 minutes and am looking forward to exchange with you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. And I think you just hit the 15-minute mark perfectly. So no worries. I am debating if we should have Q&A now, or if we should combine it together with YAP, but I think it was such a nice presentation. Maybe see, are there any hands? Are there any questions at this stage? Why don't we take them now? I think that might be, if you want to raise your hand or just come on in if you have any questions. I see no hands, but feel free to jump in if you have any questions. Normally I make the joke that if there are no questions, either nothing was clear or everything was clear, and I'm fairly confident in this case it was everything is clear. If there are any questions, let me suggest that we combine them at the end, because I don't see any hands going up. But thank you very much for a perfect presentation. Thank you. With that, let's go to the next presentation that we had scheduled for today. That is by Jaap de Visser on the equitable share for local government in South Africa and its redistributive effort by the working group's own Jaap de Visser. Jaap, are you with us and are you ready?
Yes, I'm here. Jamie, can you hear me?
Perfect. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Let me also put up my slides, which I hope are visible. If not, do let me know. So yeah, it's great to follow on Lena's presentation, because yeah, first it was a fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed listening to Lena and this really efficient but yet comprehensive overview of the system of decentralization and the progress and ups and downs of decentralization in Mozambique. with, of course, the emphasis on the challenge of funding local governments, which is a great segue into my topic, which is really a paper that I've prepared together with my colleagues Nico Steytler and Tanash Chigwata, and I believe Tanash is in the room. It's a paper we prepared for the International Association of Centers for Federal Studies. It's going to be published in a book. And I'm just presenting elements of it, which I think are particularly relevant for the discussion that we're having today on intergovernmental fiscal relations, in particular, the aspect of the redistributive effects and how one can, the challenges that one runs into in designing and implementing a system of equalization. So very briefly, because 15 minutes also for me, it's just very little time to present the argument. And I'm also must indicate that I'm only presenting a snapshot and a part of the paper. The full paper will become available and has lots more information and arguments in there than what I'm presenting now. But very briefly, South Africa is a very unequal country. It's the most unequal country in the world when measured against the Gini coefficient. And that inequality is, of course, interpersonal inequality, but also manifests itself in inequality between subnational areas, subnational jurisdictions, between provinces and between municipalities. I will not go into any further detail on how that inequality manifests. I think many of us can imagine what that looks like. But it's one of, if not the greatest problem that South Africa is faced with, this grinding inequality and this gap between the rich and the poor. Now, one of the many things that the government has done to counter this inequality is introduce a policy of free basic services, both as a combating of poverty a strategy, but also an equalization strategy. Free basic services essentially means that poor households are entitled to a basket of free basic municipal services, namely electricity, sanitation, water, and refuse removal at basic levels. That is an entitlement. It's also based on our constitution that guarantees access to these basic services. So that policy was introduced in 2000, and the funding of that policy, of course, the implementation was going to be done by local government, because local government provides these basic municipal services, very much similar to what Lena explained, are the functions of local authorities in Mozambique. It's very similar in South Africa. Water, sanitation, electricity, refuse removal are municipal services. Municipalities are supposed to implement this free basic services policy, so they needed to be funded for this. And this is where the intergovernmental fiscal system comes into the picture. How does the national government implement this free basic services policy? By funding local governments to do this. Now, a very quick overview of our intergovernmental fiscal system. It's just as a backdrop, so just a basic, so that one can follow and understand the argument that I'm going to make, because the argument that I'm making is that the free basic services funding policy is a bit of a hit and miss, and that it is not working adequately. And this may be, hopefully, is an interesting a case study also for other countries on the continent that are either busy designing intergovernmental fiscal grants, unconditional grants, conditional grants, or that are implementing them. But in order to understand or to sort of follow that argument, a quick overview of the intergovernmental fiscal system. So we have provinces, 9 provinces and 257 municipalities. Provinces really do not have much in the way of own revenue. They're almost entirely reliant on intergovernmental grants. But municipalities have much greater own revenue, powers and responsibilities, and they raise a significant portion of their budget from their own, from delivering services and levying a property tax. Nevertheless, the fiscal gap is there, obviously for provinces who have a huge fiscal gap because they don't raise their own revenue, but also municipalities. They vary in terms of size, in terms of population, in terms of fiscal capacity, in terms of fiscal potential. in terms of economic activity. So there's a variety, there's huge differentiation amongst municipalities in terms of how much revenue they can raise from their own citizens by delivering services and levying property rates. So that is when intergovernmental transfers come in, that mostly come from the national government, because the provincial government don't really have any funding to disburse. So the intergovernmental transfers for local government, they leapfrog the provinces and they go straight to local government. This is guaranteed in the Constitution, that municipalities have a right to a portion of national revenue. It's called an equitable share. This is entrenched in our Constitution. So that is a very strong protection of local government autonomy, in that they have an entitlement to an equitable share of national revenue. The process towards deciding what that equitable share is for local government and for individual municipalities culminates every year in a Division of Revenue Act, which is an act of parliament that is passed together with the budget, that sets out who's going to get what. It sets out the vertical division of revenue. In other words, of the national fiscus, what goes to local government, what goes to provincial government, and what stays with the national government. And roughly the vertical division has been for the last couple of years that local government receives 10% of the national fiscus, so considerably more than the 1.5% that Lena was talking about for local governments in Mozambique, even though the comparison doesn't really hold, but still 10% is a much bigger percentage. 40% for provinces and 50% stays with national government, even though some of that does make its way to local government through conditional grants again. So roughly that is the division vertically of the national fiscus. And then what the Division of Revenue Act also does is it then sets out in detail within each sphere of government, within the provincial sphere and within the local government sphere, how much is going to be allocated to each province and to each municipality. So that is what we then call the horizontal division, which is done in terms of a formula, which I will speak to in a moment. Because municipalities receive the unconditional equitable share, and in addition to that, a range of conditional transfers managed by sector departments at national government level, who pursue these conditional transfers, oversee them, and obviously in order to pursue their own national priorities and to support municipalities around specific areas where they need to improve their performance. The Division of Revenue Act process is very robust. It's every year it repeats itself. It's a cycle of consultation between local government, provincial government, the National Treasury, and the Independent Finance and Fiscal Commission. It's a very robust and progressive, I think, system in which each sphere of government has a voice, even though ultimately it is, of course, the national government that decides, because it is the National Division of Revenue Act. But there is a robust engagement between the three spheres of government, which I think is something that we have a lot of problems in South Africa in terms of our intergovernmental system and our multi-level government. But I think our process of arriving at a Division of Revenue Act every year is something we can be proud of, and it has played a major role, not only in managing the fiscal system, but also, I would argue, in sustaining peace in South Africa, because it's a very contentious issue, but the process is transparent. One doesn't have to agree with the outcome, but it is a predictable process, and it repeats itself every year. So if you lose a battle in year one, you can always pick up the same battle in year two, because you know that the process will repeat itself. So that very quickly on the overview of the intergovernmental fiscal system, within which then this argument plays out around three basic services, the role of local government and the funding of it. Because if one looks at the formula for the local government equitable share, one sees there that it comprises these five elements on the left. There's a basic services component, an institutional component, a non-trading community services component, a revenue adjustment component, and a correction component. Now, if we start with quickly with the second one and run through them very quickly, the institutional component is basically to support municipalities to run their administrations and to pay their councillors. The third component, the non-trading component, is to compensate municipalities for services that they deliver, which they cannot bill for, that are not billable services. They are non-trading services such as environmental health, firefighting, roads, cemeteries, planning, street lighting, and parks. You cannot send a bill to anyone for delivering that services. So some compensation comes to the municipality through this component of the equitable share formula. Then there is a very important revenue adjustment component, which looks at the fiscal potential of the municipality. How much should it be able to raise in terms of its own revenue? When one looks at the income of individuals in that municipality, the property values and the number of households on communal lands, unemployment rates and the number of poor households, that gives a picture of the fiscal potential of that municipality, and that is then taken into account so as to make sure that municipalities don't benefit from not raising revenue that is due to them. So the message of this formula is, if you don't raise the revenue that is due to you, that is your problem. That is not the national government's problem. You will not be compensated for that because there is a revenue adjustment element in the equitable share formula. And lastly, there's a correction and stabilization factor that just makes sure that there's no huge jumps from one year to another, which makes the process predictable and relatively transparent. Now, focusing in on the first one, the basic services component of the equitable share, because that is where this argument plays itself out, because this is the biggest element of the formula, which is a subsidy for the municipality for providing these free basic services that the national government is promising households. So water, electricity, sanitation, and refuse for poor households is subsidized through this formula. And what happens is that the national government, the national treasury, counts the number of poor households in the municipal area, and it uses as a benchmark. A poor household is a household that has less than 2 state pension grants, the value of that. And if that is the scenario in a household, it will be counted as a poor household. So the National Treasury counts the number of poor households in the municipality and then adds a subsidy for each of those poor households into the formula for that municipality. So in essence, the municipality receives a subsidy for every poor household in its area, supposed to be used for providing free basic services to that particular household. One may ask, where does the National Treasury get all this wisdom and this information from? So it would use the National Statistics Agency, Stats SA. They are an independent statistics agency, provide excellent statistical services. They are under a bit of pressure because of budget cuts, but they still managed to produce a census 2 weeks ago from 2021. And they regularly conduct community household surveys and produce credible data on that can be used to calculate the equitable share. Now, so it's the top part that really is the important element of this argument. Now, it's important to now look at what happens in practice. So firstly, as I indicated, the equitable share goes to municipalities. Every year it is calculated over a 3-year horizon, and it is transferred in tranches, very predictable, transparent. The numbers can be tracked on the National Treasury website, but it is transferred to municipalities as an unconditional grant. Once the municipality receives the grant, it may do with it as it pleases, as long as it adheres to public finance management rules. There's no condition to the equitable share. So municipalities decide what to do with the money that they receive in the form of this equitable share. Secondly, when it comes to identifying poor households that are deserving of these free basic services, municipalities make their own decisions. They determine their own tariff and debt collection policies internally. And in terms of those policies, they identify poor households that are eligible for free basic services. So then if we look at what happens in practice, we see that the disjuncture then arises. And this is in this next slide. As indicated, the national policy is free basic services for poor households. The National Treasury subsidizes it. It estimates the number of poor households and cost of services and transfers the subsidy as an unconditional grant. The municipality implements it by deciding who qualifies and by delivering the service. Now, a very important research that was done by Tracy Ledger, who works for the Public Affairs Research Institute, formulated in a research report called Access to Basic Services, which is freely available on PARI's website, shows a huge disjuncture between the funding that the National Treasury transfers to municipalities and the number of poor households that is based on, and how many poor households are actually identified by municipalities as deserving of free basic services. You see the disjuncture there is for each service around more than 8 million. So the National Treasury designs and funds an equalization program based on its interpretation of what is a poor household, transfer that money to the municipalities in the form of an unconditional grant. But then municipalities take that money and then decide what to do with it. They make their own calculations in terms of what is a poor household. And as a result, most poor households identified by the National Treasury are actually excluded from the free basic services. And the staggering amount of 40 billion rand in equitable share destined for poor household is actually diverted elsewhere. And municipalities use the money for all kinds of other purposes. Some very, very legitimate projects, service delivery, administration, but some also mischievously, for frivolous expenditure. So there is that huge disjuncture. So what to do about this? This is then sort of the question that policymakers must confront. How do we fix this? And we identify in the paper 3 avenues. The one would be to insist on more local democracy, because there is intergovernmental oversight over this. National Treasury, provincial treasuries, they raise this with municipalities, they ask for clarification, they prod and ask for questions, but in the end, they have no stick. The stick ultimately is a local stick. Within that municipality, there's a need for more local accountability. Municipal councils, municipal public accounts committees that look at the finances of their municipality need to ask much tougher questions about the use of the equitable share by municipalities and the diversion of the funds away from the purpose for which it is destined, namely supporting poor households with basic services. The second option is the least favorable one, which is more conditionality. If the problem is that municipalities use the unconditional grant for a purpose for which it is not really intended, should it maybe be made conditional? Should the basic services component be taken out of the equitable share and made a conditional grant? Now, that would be a huge step back for local government autonomy and would be quite an undermining of South Africa's commitment to devolution and to local democracy. But it is a question that is going to be asked if this continues. Then lastly, I think the big question that needs to be asked is, why do municipalities do this? It's not all because of mischief and because of not wanting to support the poor. It is also because the funding framework for local government is desperately wanting. Services are expensive to provide. Poverty is all over and grinding. Municipalities are suffering in terms of their funding framework, and there's a fundamental relook necessary at the formula and at the local government fiscal system. For example, local government only receiving 10% of the national fiscus is perhaps no longer in step with the requirements that are placed on municipalities in terms of the services that they have to provide. But hopefully this gave a bit of an insight into, further down the line, once an intergovernmental fiscal framework is in place, questions continue to come up in terms of how it is implemented, what data is used, and what conditionalities are there or should be there. In that sense, intergovernmental fiscal relations always is work in progress. And I hope that this bit of insight into the questions that we have here in South Africa is of use to some of the colleagues elsewhere on the continent. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jaap. That was an excellent presentation. I appreciate how you linked it to the presentation about municipal finance in Mozambique. Clearly a very different policy conversation, but ultimately I think where there's an area of overlap perhaps is that ultimately you're funding municipal services, and through the grant system or through own source revenues, there needs to be a link between those. I saw there is one question for Lena, but I was wondering if anybody has a question for Jaap or a comment on the presentation. If you feel free to jump in or put your hand up as you prefer.
Hi, Jamie. Can you hear me?
Here is Mike. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, hi. My name is Mike Kishishian, and I used to work for USAID on decentralization. And I had a question for Lena on the budgets in Mozambique. And while 1.5% of the total share of the budget is not a lot, the fact that they raised 20% of it on their own isn't bad, I think. And I'm wondering, at aid, we used to think that local governments would be held more accountable for funds that they raise themselves, as opposed for funds that magically appear from the center. And this may be an unfair question if you weren't looking for it, but was it at all observable that the local population was more keen on seeing what was happening with the property taxes they were paying, or did it all just go into one big pot and it's really not distinguishable? Thank you.
Shall I come in immediately, Jamie?
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Very interesting question. Now, of course, I don't have robust data, to put any of the statements I will make on this to base them on, right? And I think I need to clarify also that the numbers I showed, I think it was 19% in a selection of 8 municipalities out of 53. And just reiterating or underlining, this is the result of quite a number of years of heavy investment in own revenue raising capacities. That is not the average of municipal revenue collection capacity in Mozambique, with, let's say, maybe the exceptions of the large cities like Beira, Maputo, Matola. Yeah, they of course are a different kettle of fish. But the smaller municipalities will raise more, between 5 and 10%. And this is the result of our investment. But because municipalities are so underfunded in general, quite a lot of that money, unfortunately, also ends up being used for salaries. Yes, maybe some small infrastructures, some small repairs of some local street, of a municipal street may be done with this. But in how far it translates into large changes for the citizen, I have question marks. But we're actually doing this. We will work much more on this in the years to come. We want to track much more and much better than before how these funds are used, to be able to respond to this critical question you posed. But to come to the second element, I do think, and most citizens in the municipalities in Mozambique still do not pay local taxes or fees. So this is still it's a large uphill battle to get of tax education, etc., and to make the link between I'm as a municipal citizen paying my local fees, duties, and taxes, and this is what I'll get for it. We have a huge local tax education program running, which has its impact. And I think it does lead to further questions being asked. And we work with the municipal assemblies. Also, they are radio programming their sessions outside. These questions are being asked. But again, this is qualitative evidence from our selected partner municipalities that this is the case. I wouldn't be able to, put strong evidence behind that. Thanks.
Maybe, Jaap, could I put you on the spot and maybe address the same question that Mike just asked? And maybe anecdotal, do you see a relationship between municipalities where own source revenues are high and responsiveness, or is that not the case? What's your impression?
Well, most certainly, we see the difference between our provinces and local government. Let me start there, because our provinces do not raise their own revenue. They're completely reliant on national transfers. And probably as a result, citizens and voters don't really care what provinces do. We have provincial legislatures, we have members of parliament in our provincial legislatures, and they are elected by voters, but our voters don't really hold provincial politicians accountable. I'm generalizing, but that's sort of the overall trend. Move to local government. Local government is the object of almost daily service delivery protests, where angry citizens burn tires and block roads because they're angry about service delivery. And many of those challenges have to do with local government services, sometimes even unfairly directed at local government, even though it's not local government's problem. But certainly one can see a much more vociferous relationship between the public, citizens, voters, and local government as compared to with provinces. To make a further distinction, I think, between those municipalities that raise a lot of revenue and those that do not, the level of anger that citizens have about a lack of services, that sort of cuts across the board to all municipalities. And there's not really a huge distinction that I can observe. But certainly the principle that, local revenue generation enhances accountability is something that we observe very clearly in South Africa when one compares provinces with local government. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that bit of added wisdom in the comparison between provinces and municipalities. That's very helpful. I'm trying to get to my chat. Apologies, we're running a few minutes over, but I don't want to cut Q&A short. There's a question from Jane Maru to Lena, whether or not there are vibrant citizen oversight forums at the municipal level in Mozambique. If that is something that you can answer in 30 seconds or less.
Define vibrant. Define vibrant. I think it also depends a lot on. It depends also a lot, again, also on external support often, because vibrant citizen oversight mechanisms also need certain funds, and we work in a context of extreme poverty. Sometimes. So even for people to come together, there needs to be an external actor who assists with us. So you find more vibrant frameworks where there is an external funding source to bring this into being. But there are the exceptional cases. I remember Dondo municipality close to Beira. Have been like a highlight of participatory budgeting since the early 2000s, and use their own funds to go forward with this process. Yeah, so there are cases, but I wouldn't say this is across the board.
Super, and it stands in some contrast to what Jaap just mentioned about burning tires in the street when services are not delivered, even though that is not necessarily the kind of community engagement we wish for. At least it is community engagement. In any case, if there are no further questions, and since we are running almost 10 minutes over, unless there are any burning questions at the last minute, of course, we can always reach the colleagues who have done a wonderful job presenting both South Africa and Mozambique's current situation. So thank you for that. Also, thanks to Zemelak and Nick. for their earlier presentations.
Jamie, shall I give a very quick answer to the two questions of Judy and John? I'll
Sure.
try to do so as quickly as I can.
Absolutely.
So Judy, Judy's question on where the percentage of revenue share of local government actually go to development. I'm hesitant to give a percentage. So I'm gonna skip that one and get back to you with more detail. I think I don't want to venture there. But the second question is, do the local governments always meet their own revenue source targets? So the big answer is no, they don't. Very often they produce unfunded budgets. They overestimate their revenue collection and then end up in trouble somewhere during the year. So that's definitely a major challenge in our system. John's question, is it perhaps because of better data? I'm not so sure. I think the problem is bigger than that. One quick anecdote, which I learned from my wife, who was doing oversight over municipalities. So sometimes municipalities appoint specific staff to clean up and reduce the indigent register. In other words, the number of poor households. So they send people out into the community to count satellite dishes and count cars and see how, find ways to argue that people on the poor household register are actually not poor, and then collect evidence to chuck these people off the poor household register. And research indicated that the municipality was paying more in terms of salaries for these people to chase poor people than they were saving in terms of providing free basic services. So I think the problem is a bit more cynical than better granular data. It is local governments also just squeezing the poor, in addition to much bigger structural problems in the fiscal framework for local government. Thanks, Jamie.
Thanks so much, Jaap, for picking up on that. Clearly, your Zoom skills are superior to mine. The chat box tends to disappear on my screen. Anyway, thank you very much for that. Thank you again, all. There's let's conclude on this note and maybe any other business. I saw a request, Lena, is it possible to do Portuguese? Let's have a side conversation. It's certainly possible if there are colleagues coming. One of the things that we as LPSA pride ourselves in is to be able to make these conversations more accessible, and Zoom allows us to do this. And for those, if anyone was following the Francophone stream, unfortunately the interpreter had to leave to pick up her kids because we're running over time, so that was on us. But we do very much appreciate making these conversations accessible across the continent. With that, let's conclude. Any other business? I don't know, Jaap, if in your position as co-chair, you have anything to share. Maybe Lima, are there any announcements maybe you can make? I don't know if Myrna is still on as well. If you want to jump in with upcoming announcements and so forth.
Thanks, Jamie. I think Myrna has already shared the link to register for the next event, so it should be in the chat box.
Great. And if I recall, our we have the word local democracy came up at the end of Jaap's discussion. I believe November 1st, we have a working group, thematic working group on local democracy, inclusive governance, and community-led development, which we'll be launching. That is a global working group, not a regional working group, but and you're free of charge, can be part of both working groups. So if that is a topic of interest to you, please join us then. Obviously, just go to decentralization.net and click on our calendar. You'll find all the upcoming events. The Africa Working Group next meeting is January 25th, and Myrna is in the chat box circulating the registration for that. I believe I think Elizabeth from Zambia is no longer with us, but we may have potentially already another topic for the next meeting, if she's willing to share with us the progress on Zambia. Are there any other comments contributions before we close? In that case, unless there is anything, Thank you once again to all the colleagues, presenters, co-chairs of the working group. Judy, once again, welcome. We look forward to learning from you. And thank you, everyone, for a fascinating discussion. And we look forward to seeing you again at the next meeting. Thank you.